Welcome to the Melinda Eitzen Show. I'm Melinda. Today we have with us, with my office, lawyer Devin Kerns.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, I'm glad you're here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming.
Yes.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we do a lot of is complex property
That's right.
in the divorce context, right?
Absolutely.
And that makes it interesting. We don't get bored.
No. Nope. Although it might sound a little boring.
I know.
If people don't know what that is, but it's important.
It is. And in the complex property world, the law is ever changing, right? Every
yes.
2 years, we have a potential for the law to change through the legislature, but we also have case law
Yes.
that develops and modifies the law from time to time. And so it can be complicated, and we need to know what we're doing.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And I notice in my mediation practice that not all lawyers agree on the approach to all of it. But one thing that comes up again and again is the house.
Oh, yeah.
Why is that complicated sometimes?
I don't know. I think that some people don't fully realize the impact that legal documents have on, that can have later if they get divorced. You know, you get married, you're excited, maybe you refinance a house that someone already bought, or you go in together on a new house, and the way that deeds are drafted and names are taken on the title can impact a divorce later on. So it can get kind of complicated and have unintended consequences, like a gift that someone may not have intended to make.
So an example of a gift would be that, let's say somebody owned the house prior to marriage.
Yes.
So they get married, great. Interest rates come down, they decide to refinance, and when they refinance, they add their spouse.
Yes, and if they do that, then they could have given a 1/2 interest in the house to their spouse. And if they had a separate property interest in that house before marriage, maybe they didn't intend to do that. Or maybe they did, and then later things go sour, and
Now they
wanna
say they
no, I
didn't."
didn't. But it's funny because, you know, a gift requires 3 elements: intent to make the gift, acceptance, and delivery of the property. So, you know, later on in a divorce, if one party is claiming you added me to this title, you gifted me that house, the other party can say, no, I had no intent to gift you that property, and here's why. And, you know, you can do that by testimony and documents and other people. But that can come up in divorces, and I don't think people realize that sometimes.
Right. Well, and it shows what you were just illustrating. Just the fact that they put their name on it, that may not be the end of it, right?
Right.
But it does create an issue.
Yes.
And then we have to decide, well, was that intended or not? A lot of times people don't even know what the documents say, right?
Right.
So maybe they should pay more attention.
Absolutely. You know, it is common for one spouse maybe to let the other spouse handle all the finances and all of the legal paperwork. But I think, you know, with any property matter, whether it's a house, whether it's business entity interests or the like, then you should be aware of what's going on, and at least have somebody explain that to you, especially if you're going to get married. You know, what's the harm in making sure you know what's out there.
Yes. Now, if somebody chose to have a prenup or a postnup, they could control some of this a little bit more.
Sure.
True. They could list the house as separate, say no matter what, my house remains separate, and then it doesn't matter what happens after that. Possibly,
yes, depending on how good your prenup is. But yeah, the more specific, the better in premarital agreements as well. When it comes to complex property disputes, you're going to have an agreement, but there's going to be a schedule attached to that that's going to generally list one spouse's items they want to keep separate and the other spouse's items that they want to keep separate. And if you just say house, well, that's not good enough, you know.
There might be more than one house.
Yeah, and there's legal descriptions and accounts and account numbers. So it gets the more specific and the more you know, the better. Knowledge is power. The better off you are.
Yes. There's also with houses reimbursement claims sometimes. And how does that work?
So a reimbursement claim is what it sounds like. Obviously, you've got one estate claiming a right to be reimbursed by the other estate, and so if you say you have a house and it's your separate property, and you have a mortgage on the house that may be community mortgage that you take out during the marriage, and the community is paying, like someone's personal earnings are paying off a mortgage, or maybe it's a separate property mortgage. It gives rise to a reimbursement claim between the estates.
Yeah, and you say the estates and not
Yes.
the husband and the wife, because there could be more than
Yes.
2 estates, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Her separate, his separate, community.
Yeah, depending on how the mortgage is structured and what money is paying down that mortgage could give rise to reimbursement. You also could do an improvement on the house. So if somebody has an inheritance, for example, and they decide, let's add a wing to the house with my grandfather's inheritance, but the house is a community house, then the community has a reimbursement claim. So it's pretty easy kind of once you wrap your mind around it, just where did the money come from and what is it improving and
Yes.
paying down.
Yes. Being able to trace it is important.
Yes.
Without a prenup or a postnup. So I have noticed in our big property cases that wealthy people create entities.
Yes,
They do that for business purposes. They do that for asset protection reasons. They create family limited partnerships. They create LLCs. They create businesses, corporations. And then they stick stuff in there.
Yeah, they do. They definitely do. And that's smart. I mean, the main benefit of entities is limited liability. So if there's a lawsuit, you aren't subject to liability personally. But it also can give rise to a number of issues in a divorce. Like if you have a community business and it's considered community property because it was formed during marriage, then when you're getting divorced, you need to value it. Like, what is it worth? And if you have one spouse that is running the business and has personal goodwill, and kind of without that spouse, it's not worth as much, then that can be really complicated, and is important to look at in a divorce. So you might need to get a valuation expert for those kind of things.
I just had one yesterday where the valuation expert was reporting to us in a collaborative case.
Okay.
They had done a business valuation, and it was personal services industry.
Oh, okay.
So like a lawyer or a CPA or, somebody who provides personal services. That's harder. They're not making widgets.
Right.
Right. You're not valuing how many widgets do you have in inventory.
Yeah. I'm so blessed I get to work with you and Lisa Duffee, and it's kind of like if you and Lisa weren't in the firm, then what would the firm be worth with and without you? It's a huge differentiating factor that I think some spouses don't fully realize. There's also, the risk that someone could want to hide assets during a divorce, which comes up again and again in our practice. Unfortunately,
real or imagined,
people are stressed, and sometimes, they are not feeling very good towards their soon-to-be ex-spouse, and they want to hide assets. They don't want to disclose maybe real property, maybe certain accounts, so they'll stick it in an LLC or limited partnership, and that can give rise to a really fun concept, the alter ego claim.
Yes, that sounds fun.
Yes, I know. I love that word, but it's or piercing the corporate veil, and that basically just allows the court to pierce the veil of limited liability and divide the underlying assets in a company in the event of your divorce, because otherwise the court just has the interest, like the stock ownership interest.
Yeah. So if you don't pierce the corporate veil, so to speak, or successfully make an alter ego claim, the court might be limited in what it can do with that asset. And that's what somebody is putting forward is, hey, that's in a partnership. You can't do anything with that. You can't dig into the partnership and start taking the partnership assets. The court can't really do that, right? They're limited to just awarding the partnership interest itself.
Especially if there's third parties involved in an entity.
Oh, right. They didn't sign up for this.
Exactly.
But sometimes you can say, wait a minute, that was basically fraud. You did that only for the purpose of divorce asset protection. You don't just get to go stick stuff in an entity. The first person to stick something in an entity wins. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, there has to be that remedy because, you know, it's essentially a fraudulent transfer. So it'd be unfair to allow a spouse to say, I don't have any assets. You know,
Right.
our ABC LLC has all of the assets,
I stuck it all in a trust.
and I gave my best friend an interest in the entity, so you can't affect his. No,
Right, for $1.
no. Yeah, and we had a case that touched on bankruptcy because there was an entity that went through bankruptcy. So that's also something that could happen. And so family law is interesting because it touches on so many areas of law. And I worked in commercial litigation before doing family law, so it's a cool area so I can use my previous experience and also learn about new areas of the law that, doing a really narrow area of the law wouldn't allow you to do.
Right. Yeah, we touch everything. Yeah. And we hire experts when needed.
Oh, yeah. It doesn't mean we know everything, that's for sure.
Issue spotting. We're good at issue spotting.
Oh, yeah.
One thing that comes up in complex property is when they didn't do it fraudulently, but they did it as part of their estate planning. It's all about taxation, right? They're trying to avoid paying, as everyone does legally, try to avoid any more money in taxes than they have to.
Oh, yeah.
So they're tax planning, estate planning, and they form entities for that purpose sometimes. But when we're divorcing them, we want to be aware of that, right? We don't want to mess up their estate planning.
Yes.
So sometimes we have to hire or bring in their estate planning lawyers.
Oh yeah, it's super important, and especially with entity interests and like corporations, because corporations can be taxed differently. Like if you have an S corp, and any, like you said, any estate plan, or if you have guardianship issues, those can arise too. So. Having experts at your disposal is really important, and I think that sometimes people don't want to pay for them in divorces because they're already, feel like going through a divorce is expensive, which it can be. But if you're in a contentious divorce, it's worth it. So, and if you have these big assets, especially to like retirement benefits as well, and you're looking at a huge pile of money that would be significantly taxed if you did it one way versus the other, it's worth it.
Yeah,
to
sort
experts.
it out, right?
Yes.
We need to make sure, get the CPAs involved and make sure that we understand the tax effect of dividing certain things.
And sometimes I just had a case where we had two different CPAs on both sides because they differed on the tax, issues
analysis.
And so you can get into a battle of the experts, and that can happen in a divorce as well. So
because the Internal Revenue Code is not simple.
That you're telling me. Yes,
so
exactly.
CPAs could differ, and tax lawyers could have different opinions.
Absolutely.
One thing that is great is when people divide something between them, that is not in and of itself a taxable event in a divorce. So if I just went and pulled money out of my 401k, I'm going to pay tax and penalty because I'm not old enough, although I'm getting close, to pull it out without avoiding that penalty. But in divorce, they can divide it, right?
Right, yeah. If you roll over an IRA incident to a divorce, generally, I'm not a CPA, but generally you don't have to worry about taxes. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. And I think that's wise. But, sometimes when we do a settlement, it would require taking a loan out on an existing 401k or retirement asset to pay maybe for attorney's fees or things of that nature. And so you have to be aware that wouldn't be incident to a settlement, right? So if you're going through a divorce and you're looking for liquidity, that issue can come up too. So I think it's smart to not only be aware of the tax implications when you reach a final settlement, but potentially having to touch those assets to get you through to get to a final settlement or trial.
Yeah, one thing I learned, you learn from every case, but what happens is they said, hey, I need to pull some money out of the 401k, a loan. What's great about a 401k, generally speaking, you can take a loan instead of a distribution, and then you just pay yourself back.
Right.
And then you're not having that penalty occur. So people like that vehicle, but you can't take like a $5,000 loan today and then a $5,000 loan tomorrow. You can usually not take a loan if there's a loan outstanding, and you're only allowed to borrow typically certain percentage of the 401k, like let's say 1/2. So people need to consult with their professionals associate that are managing those assets,
Definitely.
to say, what are the rules?
Yeah. And if you don't have one, to get one, I think that's important, just, in life as well, especially if you are a spouse that hasn't taken an active role in your finances. I think going through the divorce process can be very enlightening and like light a fire under some people to get take a closer look at what's going on in their day-to-day life and their finances, and especially if they haven't been working and they need to start working as a result of the divorce.
Sometimes people are embarrassed when they come to see me because they don't know anything.
Right.
And I don't think they need to be embarrassed. It's a natural thing to divide your energy in a marriage and have one person be responsible for certain things and one person be responsible for the other things. But now's the time, if they're getting divorced, they might have to be drinking from the fire hose.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes people think traditionally the husband may be the one that takes more of an active role, and the wife sometimes may not. But in my experience, it's been either way. It's not always the husband that's the one that's controlling the finances. So I think people might be surprised by that. But it's really, if people, and it makes sense if someone has more of a affinity for handling the finances, why not? But there's no excuse for really not being aware of what's going on, especially if you think you're about to get divorced.
Yeah, it's better to be informed, right? At least have access.
Yes.
Even if you're not the one touching it on the regular, to at least have access. Sure. When people are maybe contemplating, like they're not really ready to get divorced, but they're kind of thinking about it, so they might call and just get a little information. I tell them, be sure you're going, like if there's an annual meeting with your financial professional, you should be attending that meeting and understanding. And because I've had so many cases where they say, well, she or he was invited. Right. They just chose not to come. Like, well, go get informed. Yes. Sometimes we don't really want to know, right?
Yeah. Well, but it's, it's important because then you get the documents and the paperwork you need, because sometimes in a contentious, complex property case, just getting access to just us as the lawyers getting access to the documents that we need can be challenging, you know? So if you already thought ahead and got copies of everything you can think of regarding your finances, that helps us a lot on the front end. And it actually will end up probably saving you money because you don't have to go through these discovery disputes that can be little mini trials on their own.
And tax returns tell a lot. If people just make sure every year they get a copy of their tax return. One, be sure you're reading and signing your own tax return. And, they can, in these cases, they're complicated. They're going to have to rely on some expertise of the CPA. But they could certainly talk it through with the CPA and make sure they understand it before they sign it. And then keep copies of those tax returns, because a lot of the assets will be revealed because on the tax return they're reporting some kind of dividend or overseas money or whatever.
Definitely. And I think even like loan application documents are important. So that tells a lot, because people can get creative in hiding assets even on tax returns that you may not know about. And so if you can get loan application documents as well, and personal financial statements of maybe you have a financial statement you don't even know about that your spouse has prepared, but that's really helpful for us, especially because it's funny, a lot of, high net worth clients, especially on the opposing side, may actually say, I don't have a lot of money. I don't have access to all this liquidity, but then it doesn't look like that on the paperwork. So, because,
when they're trying to get a loan, everything's worth a lot more.
A lot more is right. Yeah. So it's kind of funny how the different contexts people will estimate their net worth quite differently.
They're like, well, I was trying to get money.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course I said that was worth $1 bajillion.
Absolutely.
Now it's worth nothing.
Yes. And that's...
But I want it.
Oh my gosh. And that goes into the alter ego claim we were talking about before. If they're running, look at the expenses of the entity, right? Are they running expenses that don't traditionally correlate to what the business is doing? Like if they have a mechanics shop, are they running, like, I don't know, beauty parlor expenses or like gambling expenses or traveling expenses for potentially, a paramour or mistress through a mechanic shop. Okay.
That should
That's
raise
not
a red
legitimate.
flag.
Exactly.
They should not be claiming that.
No.
Yeah, one thing that we deal with a lot is business owners. And sometimes they don't have a lot of complicated entities. They have a business.
Right.
And they run their whole life through that business. In their mind, the business is their investment. It is their retirement. They funnel a lot of the money from the business back into the business.
Sure.
The business is their life. And sometimes when it's a small business, they also run all their expenses through it. Like not what my CPA would say is allowed.
Right.
So you have to really dig into that because it doesn't make sense. And you don't want them to say, oh, well, the business isn't really making money and it isn't worth very much. Well, the reason it's not showing a profit is you are running all of your living expenses through it. And you're not really allowed to do that. That's not a business expense.
It's tough and closely held entities, they don't really observe. I think what you're talking about are corporate formalities, right? When you think about a corporation, you think, oh, there's a board of directors and shareholders that vote on everything, and then you have officers that carry out the business. When you have a closely held corporation, you might have a couple of people who are in all of the roles, and so or God forbid one person that's running everything. Oh man. But yeah, exactly. So it's tough because I think in Texas too, Texas respects the ability to do that and the freedom and having a business, and they want to promote a thriving business, but you have to be careful when you're going through a divorce. Things are different.
Yes.
And especially if you're the one doing that, I would be really careful.
One thing I do a lot of collaborative, as you know, and in collaborative cases, the rule is open information exchange.
Sure.
Like you don't have to send a formal request. Any information you want, you get. And one thing we talk about is you're trying to build trust during the case in order to reach a point where you can trust the information and say yes to a deal. But in order to do that, you really have to open the kimono and just show all of what really is happening.
For sure.
And sometimes it's not that they're trying to do something tricky. They've always done that. You just didn't know it.
Right. Right. That can be quite surprising.
So that's helpful to just see the historical pattern. Are we just suddenly running things through the business we never did? Or has that just been the pattern? That's how they operated their lives. Might not have been proper. Might have a problem with IRS someday.
Yes.
That's not our concern. We're not going to go report anybody to the IRS.
Exactly.
We're going to just help them do what they can to make the best agreements possible.
Right. I mean, and I think this also gives rise to, like we were talking about reimbursement claims, and you can have a claim about a spouse's time, toil, and labor spent on an entity. And so that's kind of a vague term, right? But if they're spending their time to improve a separate property business, but they're doing that during the marriage, well, that would otherwise,
brought income in
into the community. So we see those issues a lot as well.
What's sad is you don't get to say their time, toil, and talent watching TV.
I know.
You're not required to work in the marriage.
Right.
So that's a challenge.
On their iPad. Yes.
Yeah, everybody's on their devices.
Yes.
Right? So let's talk about people who, it's not necessarily true that they have a business. Maybe they work for a corporation, but they have complex benefits. And we see them, over my career, I've seen them evolve. And early in my career, 30 years ago, a lot of people had pensions, very few pensions anymore. Mainly where you see them is still in government. And in the corporate world, it's changed to restricted stock units or stock options. It seems like less stock options, more restricted stock units now. And they will give them to people with a vesting schedule.
Oh, yes. Yeah, no, I'm seeing that so much. And I think, one thing that's important to understand, and I probably should have said this earlier in this show, but the inception of title role is huge when it comes to characterizing complex property. And that just simply means, whenever you first had a claim to a piece of property is whether it gets characterized as separate or community. So is it before marriage or after marriage? And
or during
marriage. Yeah. And for RSUs, restricted stock units, they're kind of this phantom stock that's not like a real stock share, but it vests at a certain point, but it may be granted over a period, granted earlier, and then you wait until it vests. And so the time period of when it was granted, when it vests, whether that's before you got married, after you got married, during the marriage, and I guess what time period it covers can create some unique issues. I definitely would recommend a financial expert. I mean, we handle those all the time, but if you've got some really complicated schedule, it's worth it. And same with bonuses. Bonuses are, personal earnings during a marriage of our community. But if a bonus is awarded after you get divorced, but it's for work that you did during the marriage, that's potentially community, or a portion of it community. So it gets complicated.
Things to consider.
Things to consider, yes. Yeah, I mean, I think people think, I'm going to get this bonus, 9 months from now, and probably we'll have a decree by then, so I don't even need to disclose it on the inventory that we exchange, and that's just not accurate.
Yeah, because it's being earned.
Exactly.
Depending on the nature of the bonus.
Right.
Because there's different types. But let's just say your average Joe bonus, where I work hard all year, and if that corporation runs on a fiscal year that's a calendar year, then I probably get my bonus in the first quarter of next year.
Right.
Well, if you were married part of that working hard time,
yeah, exactly,
then that part of your bonus is community, potentially. And just to make it more confusing, the case law doesn't always agree. Right. So then we could argue about it.
Exactly. But no, I mean, RSUs can be really valuable, and it kind of seems, I think the other spouse that may not be the spouse with the RSUs may not understand what they are and that they have value. And I think getting that spouse to understand how valuable they are and that they would be worth getting a valuation expert on can be a challenge sometimes, because they look like, I get 75 of these RSUs at this point. And we're like, well, the company, a lot of times it's based on the internal valuation of a company.
Right.
So you don't necessarily know what that is, and they'll come out with those valuations periodically.
Yeah.
It can get really complicated. Yeah. And having access to those documents is helpful too. I mean,
yes, the grant documents as they happen.
All of the retirement plan documents. Yeah, from the company itself.
And that's actually, if you weren't in collaborative where it's just open exchange and you were in litigation forum, that's not hard to get, because you could subpoena the company.
Right.
And they're not going to hide anything to benefit anyone. They're going to follow the rules and give you the document. So I like it when when I'm not dependent on the other side to give it to me, because maybe they're giving me all of it, maybe they're not. When I can go to a third party, I love that.
Right.
And sometimes they will just say, here you go.
Sometimes they're willing to get depending on the company, if they have a general counsel, in-house counsel, you can talk to them and say, okay, I've got
How does this work? Right?
Yeah, super complicated document. Can you just, teach me what's going on here? And hopefully they'll be willing to do that.
Yes.
But not every time, but.
Yeah, it depends on the company, but a lot of them, they've dealt with this before.
Oh, yeah. And I think that goes into, third-party entities that you're dealing with. Maybe if the spouses have some friends they've formed an entity with, and if there are transfer restrictions in the underlying document, like you may not be able to just transfer your shares or your LLC interest just willy-nilly as part of a divorce, because anytime you're dealing with third parties, you've got to see the documents of what's governing the relationship.
Same with trusts.
Yes.
When people say, it's in a trust, I'm like, well, I need to see what the trusts say.
Yes.
They all say different things. I had one case where he kept saying, it's in my trust, it's in my trust. And I said, I need to see all the trust documents.
Yeah.
There was no longer a trust. They had all reached maturity.
Oh my goodness.
They had all been poured out. No trust existed. But they used to. A lot of trusts end at a certain age for someone. They're trying to get the person mature enough before they just dump all this money on it.
Right.
And it was that kind of deal. He'd already received all the money. So when he said it was in a trust, that's just how he thought about that money, because it used to be in a trust. That's a huge difference.
Right.
For us and how we're assessing what's separate property, what's not, what's divisible. So, you have to be sure you're insistent on eyeballs on the paper.
Yeah, and depending on what kind of money you're getting from the trust can also depend on the characterization can depend on that. So
yes.
If you're getting a distribution of the corpus, what was the character of that corpus? Was it separate property or was it community? Mm-hmm. And there's actually kind of an open question on just trust income and mm-hmm. how that's characterized. Mm-hmm. So it can get complicated. I've seen trusts that are in different states. So again, we might need to talk to some other state's attorney in addition to an estate mm-hmm. attorney. So there's
some of them talk about what happens at divorce.
Right.
I had one where the trust was benefiting both the husband and the wife.
Okay.
It had been created during their marriage by a third party relative. And it said, if they divorce, this is what happens. And of course it said, we divide the assets of the trust in half, but then the trust owned real estate. Mm-hmm. So does that mean we have to sell all the real estate? It owned real estate that had businesses on it.
Oh my.
Yeah.
So just seeing the issues,
to unwind.
Just seeing the issue spotting.
I know. Yeah. So we had to involve a trust lawyer because really the whole estate was pretty much in these trusts.
Right.
And now we had to unwind all that. Of course, there's some things you can do if you agree. There's times that you can work with a trust lawyer and other types of lawyers to try to make it so.
Right.
But these were not revocable trusts. They were irrevocable trusts. So your options are a little bit more limited on what you can do. And they had other beneficiaries. So I know.
I think, it can get so complicated, but trusts are also a good tool for, you're so creative in your approach to mediation and collaborative cases, but do you find that you use trust as a settlement tool? Like if somebody's really worried about their offspring with another person, or it's just a good tool to protect interests.
One collaborative case we had, it was interesting. The husband was willing to be very generous mm-hmm. with his separate property included, with the wife more than a court would ever order, but he was worried that if she got it in a lump sum due to some limitations she had, she might be taken advantage of by mm-hmm. other people. So he wanted it to be paid out to her more like you would think of as annuity or a pension or alimony.
Yeah.
But her counsel, of course, didn't want her to be dependent on alimony that they may or may not be able to pay in the future. So we ended up funding a trust.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And there was a third-party trustee that was neither of them, who just made sure she had enough money to live, but didn't allow her to be taken advantage of by maybe a third party who could come in and say, hey, give me all your money.
Yes. Yes.
So that was interesting. And, to facilitate that costs money. Trust costs money to form. They cost money if you're going to have to pay the trustee. But in this instance, there was enough money that we were talking about and enough concern that it was worth it to them.
That's amazing.
It was
what a great result.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, we are out of time.
Oh, my goodness. That flew by.
But this was so great, Devin, in helping people to understand the complexities that can exist, that they need to be aware, do a little preparing if they can, right? Gather some stuff, and otherwise hire people who know what they're doing.
Yes, there's definitely people that are willing to help and are really good at what they do. And if we can't help, we can find someone to help, whether it's an expert or the like. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Time. We're going to put on the screen how to reach Devin.
Oh, great.
So someone can reach out and say, what were you talking about again?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching the Melinda Eitzen Show. And hopefully we've helped pique your interest on complex property and what to do to make sure you're in the best position, whether you're getting married and you need a prenup to make this a little less complicated, you're in your marriage and you need a partition agreement maybe, which is like a prenup while you're married to make it less complicated, or you find yourself in a divorce. It's important to have information and knowledge so that you can make the best decisions. Thanks for watching.